What can we do better in asking questions about the Iran conversation and their nuclear resources that we did not necessarily do with Iraq or Afghanistan?
Well, I think the principal obligation should be to demand that there's actual evidence before believing the claims that are being made about Iran. For example, the president began by saying that Iran is violating the rules which all nations are required to abide by, and that seems to be actually false. The only obligation that Iran has under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is to disclose any facilities at least 180 days before nuclear material is introduced, and they did that well in advance of 180 days. They did it at least a year and a half before that facility is operable. And at the same time, America's key ally in that region, Israel, refuses to belong to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, refuses to have its nuclear stockpile inspected by the IAEA. And so there are nations, beginning with Israel, that refuse to comply with these rules. And I just think that the level of hysteria being generated about what is a facility that is not in operation, has no nuclear material in it, can very well be designed strictly for civilian purposes, and that Iran itself disclosed to the IAEA requires a lot more media scrutiny and skepticism towards the claims that are issuing about Iran. Responsible people judge things by actions and not by rhetoric. There is all kinds of rhetoric issuing from, for example, the United States. I mean, John McCain stood up in the middle of the presidential campaign and sung songs about bombing Iran. I think actions are what matters, and if you look at the reality at actions of the various countries, what you see is that the United States currently is occupying two nations on either side of the Iranians on their eastern and western border in Afghanistan and in Iraq, because those are countries that we invaded, bombed, and are now occupying. Over the last 5 years, the Israelis have invaded and bombed Lebanon, Syria, and slaughtered huge numbers of civilians in the Gaza Strip. By contrast, when is the last time that Iran has invaded any other country? You have to go back several centuries. Over the last several years, you've had constant threats issuing from the United States and Israel about attacking Iran militarily. And so if you want to look at who the threats are in that region and who the actual aggressors are, I think it's a very hard case to make that Iran is some sort of a unique threat because of some crazy rhetoric that its president engages in that it could never possibly carry out. And I think that's what needs to be the focal point, is what is the reality of these countries' capabilities and what their actions are.
I had a question for the other guests, and that is Glenn. So you're justifying Iran's actions in terms of possibly pursuing a nuclear program for whatever purposes, and also I find it a little ironic you're saying that it has never shown any kind of aggression, yet on Dylan's tabletop, as you were saying that, he was showing video of Iran shooting off those missiles just this past weekend. So how do those two match up? I don't understand.
Well, if testing missiles is the sign of an aggressive regime, then the United States and Israel ought to be brought before the UN and be charged with all sorts of crimes, because nobody tests missiles more frequently or more aggressively than those two countries. Testing missiles is something that virtually every nation with a military does. And what Iran is saying with the testing of those missiles is, if you're going to continuously threaten us and threaten military action, and you can pick up any American newspaper or listen to people like you on television suggesting that Iran is this evil force and for doing things that...
Well, hang on, Glenn. None of us on television have suggested Iran's an evil force, so I don't know who you're referring to.
That was just the question that was asked. The premise was, how can you possibly defend Iran for doing things that the United States and virtually every other power does?
Understood, but I don't think that Jonathan said they were an evil force.
Stockpiles of nuclear weapons.
Iran says it will not abandon its nuclear activities even for a second. It's refusing even to discuss its rights to a nuclear program at Thursday's summit in Geneva. So where does this leave the United States? Scott Ritter served as UN Chief Weapons Inspector in the 1990s, joins me now. Do you think that some of this argument over Iran's nuclear facility in Qom is overplayed?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, the nuclear facility has been declared by Iran. There's no diversion of nuclear material. There's no operational activity taking place, and it will be fully inspected by the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors. So there is no nuclear weapons program revelation here. What we have is that the United States, backed by Europe and other nations, has said that Iran cannot have a nuclear enrichment program under any circumstances, and Iran's declaration of this new facility is being used by certain elements to say, see, they were doing something in secret, we can't trust them, etc. It's not about Iran's nuclear program, frankly speaking. It's about the theocracy in Tehran and the fact that the United States has deemed the Iranian form of Islamic Republic to be incompatible with our goals and vision of what the Middle East looks like.
And in fact, in the comment that you wrote for The Guardian, you say that President Obama's announcement that Iran is breaking rules that all nations must follow is technically and legally wrong. But Scott, what about the fact that this nuclear facility is on property of the Iran Revolutionary Guard, and the fact that it's not capable of enriching the uranium needed for a peaceful nuclear power program?
Well, you know, these are questions that Iran has to answer, not myself. But the fact that they're using, military terrain to house this facility, I think it reflects the sensitivity that Iran has towards its overall nuclear program, the necessity to guarantee its survival. Let's never forget that, Israel and the United States have both said that the military option is on the table. Indeed, Israel has made repeated threats to bomb Iran. Mm-hmm. And if Iran indeed believes that a peaceful nuclear program is part of its strategic interests, building, strategic depth by having an alternative facility. Pardon?
Do you think it's counterproductive?
Well, absolutely. Look, this is a problem that's going to be resolved by diplomacy, not by force of arms. And it's ridiculous to keep talking about a military option on the table. Let's start talking about putting the diplomatic option on the table and sit down with Iran on Thursday and come up with a meaningful compromise that allows Iran to have its nuclear energy program, but to ensure that Iran is operating in total conformity with the standards that President Obama has said must be implemented to make the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty work.
Scott, you were very prescient in the lead up to the war in Iraq about the hysteria surrounding weapons of mass destruction that turned out not to be there. So what do you see the comparisons between what was happening in this country in the lead up to the war in Iraq and what's happening now in relation to Iran?
Well, if you listen to the rhetoric coming out of the Office of the Presidency, the State Department, the Department of Defense, they've already made a foregone conclusion that Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapons program. They're calling it a threat to international peace and security. But no one in the U.S. intelligence community concurs. They say there is no nuclear weapons program. The International Atomic Energy Agency keeps saying, what nuclear weapons program? The bottom line is we have the totality of Iran's nuclear material under safeguards. There's been no diversion, and there's no evidence of a nuclear weapons program. Iran declared this facility. We didn't discover it. They declared it, and it will be subjected. So there's a huge amount of correlation between the hype that led up to the Iraq war and the hype that's taking place today. And if we don't bring it under control, Americans may very well find themselves waking up one morning in the not so distant future finding that we're at yet another war in the Middle East.
So Scott, it's Dylan. You've been very effective at laying out what the reality is as opposed to what the fantasy or the fear may be or whatever the politics may be. What is it that we as journalists should be demanding as answers from our politicians as they present rhetoric, one, and two, what is it that voters should be expecting from the U.S. as a matter of policy in dealing with Iran? So journalists to politicians and voters to politicians specific to this issue with Iran.
Well, the key thing is to demand facts. This has to be a fact-based, analysis here, not faith-based. What we're getting from the Obama administration is the same thing we got from the Bush administration. Faith-based analysis. They believe Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapons program, therefore it is. But there's no evidence to back this up. Journalists should be demanding the hard facts. And when you get into the facts, you have to dig deeper. When they say that Iran is in violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, why don't we read the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? Why don't don't we understand what the obligations are before we buy into that? And what voters need to do is to talk about what's in the national security interest of the United States. Is what's going on in Iran worthy of the sacrifice of American life? Because that's what we're talking about when we say military intervention. The problem with Iran is not that it threatens the United States. The problem with Iran is that we've created a threat that doesn't exist. This is a problem that must be resolved diplomatically. We must exhaust every diplomatic option before we talk about the military option, and that's what voters should be demanding. Not to give Iran a free ride, but to insist that we give diplomacy a chance. If you listen to the rhetoric of the Secretary of State, she's already given up on Iran before we even engage in the diplomatic activity on Thursday. That's not the way to conduct diplomacy. Let's go in, let's have genuine diplomacy. It has to be give and take, not a one-way street. And then at the end of that day, Iran is not forthcoming. We determine that Iran is a threat. Then and only then do we talk about a military option. But we are so far removed from Iran being a threat worthy of military intervention that it's ridiculous to speak of military action at this time.
Scott, we appreciate so much you sharing a very different perspective than the one that is currently being shared.